I'm Anna Denicky. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, Government Relations Department, and I'm your host today for ASCE Interchange Live. Thanks for joining me today for a discussion on how to make progress on America's port infrastructure. My guest today is Tijerina Esquino, an engineer for Mott MacDonald in Oregon. She's also an advisor for the Infrastructure Report Card on the Committee on America's Infrastructure, the committee that writes and advises our national report card, as well as advises on state report cards. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get into it. ASCE's 2021 report card for America's infrastructure gave the nation's ports a B- grade, up from the 2017 report C+. With passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the profession will be able to address 7 of ASCE's recommendations concerning ports and inland waterways. So, first, how do ports impact our communities nationwide, and why is it so important to invest in these systems?
Thank you so much for the question. So, ports are really massive economic engines. They are the main entry point for the goods that we bring into the United States, with over 95% of all the cargo entering the US arriving by vessel. So, they're huge, huge part of our national economy and our transportation network. They're big GDP generators and they employ a lot of people throughout our country and allow a lot of other businesses to flourish by their availability to bring goods into the country. So as of 2018, ports contributed 26% to the total GDP. But I really think it's more than that because if you think of all the small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses that depend on this trade that we have going through our ports. I also always like to say how vessel travel is the most efficient means of travel for our cargo. So it's really important that we have this as a resource that we can maintain. And aside from all that, ports help us a lot with our national defense and our emergency preparedness and disaster response. So they really have a huge role to play for America's infrastructure.
Indeed, they do. And I liked that summary. I see why we send you in to talk to elected officials and decision makers who might not necessarily understand what a port is, much less what it does for their constituents' bottom lines and the economy overall. So, what are some of the concerns about our current port infrastructure?
That's a really good question. So we have a lot of aging infrastructure that's going to be needed to be maintained, assessed, and upgraded throughout the country. Not only are our facilities designed for a lot smaller vessels and different type of cargo than what we're moving around today, a lot of our major ports are 50 to 100 years old. So they would have to have a lot of work going on in them to keep them competitive. And specifically, like if we think about smaller ports, they could really struggle with a lot of their maintenance needs, and it could be challenging for them to find matching funds to apply for federal grants or something of the like. I touched on this a bit, but vessels and cargo is just different than when we designed these facilities originally. They are much larger and much heavier. So with larger vessels, you're going to need to dredge navigation channels to have more of that clearance. You need to upgrade your structures to facilitate the larger vessels and be able to moor them to the land. And then thinking about the changing cargo, um, thinking about like offshore wind blades, for example, they can be close to 100 meters long. That's more than 400 feet. So that's longer than a football field. So we need to be able to get those in one piece off of the vessel onto our port facilities and out into America. And that is just uh, a massive increase. It requires a massive increase of our infrastructure to be able to move these like really, really gigantic pieces of cargo that are really new to our economy and our energy systems.
Right. It's no surprise as our economy changes and as the world changes around us, we need our infrastructure to be able to adapt and modernize as well. So, we've talked about the needs. What are some of the potential consequences of neglecting to modernize and invest in our port infrastructure?
Yeah. So there are a lot of really serious consequences if we don't invest in our port infrastructure. I just mentioned offshore wind, but really with all of the things that we ship across our country, the shippers have choices of where they go and where they move things through. So if our American port aren't keeping up with the necessary investments that they need to be putting in, they're going to choose alternative routes, and it's going to hurt the U.S. economy. Um, Also, I mentioned how vessel travel is the most effective means of transportation for a lot of our cargo. Without having up to date port facilities, we would need to rely on significantly more carbon intensive and expensive modes of transport. And we really don't want to be going in that direction. And then with port facilities that are not upgraded, it's really Americans that feel that at the end of the day in like direct increases to your prices and your shipping time. I think a lot of us felt some of that during the COVID pandemic when we had a lot of increases to their congestion and delay for shipping, and that really can affect jobs in America and our competitive advantage.
Yeah, it was such a interesting time, I think, for so many Americans. You're living in Nebraska, you're wondering why you don't have toothpaste on your shelves at CVS, and you're told, well, it's actually because of an issue in Los Angeles or an issue in New York. I think that was certainly an eye-opening experience for people that hadn't thought about the freight network or the supply chain before.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and I also might add, we're talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There was also a major bill passed the same congressional cycle called the Chips and Science Act. And while ASCE focused on advancing that because it had money for research and some of the federal agencies we work with, it also contains so many incentives to spur domestic manufacturing, which of course will require our ports to help get those goods from America to their eventual destinations. So the IIJA addresses several of ASCE report card recommendations to improve port infrastructure. We were thrilled to see those codified into law. What changes are you most excited about, and what do you think will have the biggest impact?
Ooh, well, it is a very exciting time in ports right now. With the Port Infrastructure Development Program, that grew quite a bit and it caused a real boom to ports. And then there's a little bit of a change in the way that the matching cost split for grants was set up. So this is a thing that I think sometimes lay people don't understand. You do have to have these port authorities match a certain amount of the money for them to qualify for a U.S. grant. So having that match percentage change gives ports a whole new opportunity to improve their facilities. I read this quote relatively recently, and I really, really love this as well. According to the DOT, more than 60% of the grant awards from the IIJA are going to benefit ports in historically disadvantaged communities, and approximately 150 million of dollars will focus on the electrification of port equipment. So this is really, really good things, just not only for ports specifically and port engineers, but for all of our communities. And then we also have new and fewer restrictions to fund projects for multimodal projects because port infrastructure is only one part of our transportation network. You're still going to have to get that cargo out of your port facility and into a rail car or maybe onto our road system. So it's like the rising tide lifts all boats. The more that we can improve our transportation network, that is going to be what ports also need to improve their services as well. And then one more thing, because so I'm really passionate about resiliency. The IIJA has a lot of resiliency programs and requires a lot of resiliency considerations. And resiliency is a big deal for ports. In the West here where I live, we have seismic risks. There's hurricanes and wave overtopping in the east, and then sea level rise is going to be a concern really for all ports. So having that mind and that money on the resilience component is really exciting.
Absolutely. So it's obviously a very exciting time for the industry and for the sector. How is passage of the bill informing the next report card, preparation of the 2025 report card for America's infrastructure?
Yeah. So one of the findings in 2021 in our report card was that a lot of major ports were able to make large scale investments and they were preparing for the future for these larger vessels and this different cargo. But a lot of our smaller and inland ports were struggling. So we really hope that with the expanded uses of those IIJA dollars, coupled with a lot of the new and different and changed grant programs, that we're going to see those smaller and inland ports getting the support that they need to also make the necessary upgrades to keep up with their economy. And then I mentioned this again, but ports are uniquely reliant on the rest of our transportation system. So our rail system, our road system, all of the inland parts of getting our cargo to our end user really relies. Ports really rely on that part of the puzzle as well. So with IIJA funding going to a lot of these areas, it's that rising tides bringing all the boats up.
Definitely. It's certainly exciting to see the federal government think about the transportation and infrastructure system as a system of systems, right? And invest so holistically. It really will have an outsized impact on all of our infrastructure, but hopefully ports as well, or specifically ports, because as you said, they're so unique. Their success is so uniquely tied to the other modes.
Yeah.
So, you are a civil engineer. You spend a lot of time talking to non civil engineers about the importance of investing in our infrastructure, improving policy, sort of raising the profile of infrastructure. But what can civil engineers specifically do to continue raising the grades for ports?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of that civil engineers can do. For one thing, we need more people that become port engineers, and I think generally we need more people that are going to become engineers at all. When I went to university, there wasn't a port engineering classes. I honestly did not really know that this was something that I could do after I graduated from college, because I think as a lot of civil infrastructure, ports, you don't hear about them when things are going well, but you want things to go really well. And they're so critical to our country and to our communities. So we really want to bring qualified professionals into the field. ASCE does have a board certification in port engineering that one of my coworkers and another ASCE member is really involved with. So we have a lot of tools to help people get trained up, and then we also just want a more efficient use of our money. So, for ports, but also a lot of our other infrastructure, we really want to use asset management systems that can better utilize the available dollars that we have, because all um, port facilities may be strapped for cash. That's just the nature of how these businesses run. But with proper asset management, they can make sure that they're getting the best bang for their buck.
Definitely. Asset management helps make smarter and more informed decisions, and you can direct funding to the areas that need it the most if you have a better sense of your infrastructure conditions in general.
Yeah,
And I totally, oh, go ahead.
and when to fund something makes a big difference too. I mean, you can use asset management tools to tell you when specifically, not necessarily how much to fund, but when your dollars are going to have the most impact. So if you're strapped for cash, having that asset management plan could really help you spend the money that you're already going to spend, but better at the right time.
And I also just wanted to bring it back to something you said earlier about how, you were in school and you didn't realize working on port infrastructure and being a civil engineer in the port space was necessarily an option. I mean, talk about, the perfect career path for someone that is passionate about resilience. I think ports are so critical to really a regional resiliency. Certainly, ports are where goods get in and out of, people get in and out of in the instance of a major disaster. In Portland's case, perhaps an earthquake. So, really working to shore up the infrastructure at ports is a critical part of the resiliency and sustainability field that you're passionate about. So great. So speaking of which, and hopefully I didn't just steal your answer, but What role does safety, sustainability, and resilience play in developing port infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great lead in and a really, really great question. So, ports honestly have a huge, huge role to play in sustainability, resilience, and safety. I mentioned a few times, but moving cargo by vessel is the most carbon efficient means of transportation for our cargo. Um, so, the more that we can encourage a mode shift to a port to rail connection, the more that we are going to be doing in the fight against climate change. We want to get cargo out of flights and off of trucks and more into a port to rail connection as much as possible. Trucks are unfortunately still very dangerous and they literally cost American lives quite a bit. So, the more that we can encourage the safer and more carbon efficient means of travel, it's doing a lot for our sustainability as well. I think that's kind of one of the unspoken things about port engineering. Um, Not only is it cheaper to move these things by vessel, but it's better for our systems and can really save lives and take congestion out of the road and make our transportation system a little bit more effective for all of us. Um, you mentioned this a bit, but super integral to disaster preparedness and resilience. Ports essentially hold communities together after a point of disaster. So for the Cascade subductions and an earthquake that we're expecting here in the Pacific Northwest, the ports would be part of that economic engine that would get us the supplies that our region is going to need to recover. That's really, really important to be able to have and to have maintained in such a way that you know you can rely on it. Um, and then, okay, so this is a thing that I also think is kind of unspoken, but ports throughout the country are actively engaged in remediation and cleaning up our rivers. I know locally I'm working on some work that they're doing here, but and partially because ports were polluters in the past. But they're doing a lot in this field to help make our waterways healthier for all of us. So they play a role in the like sustainability and the health of our rivers that I think sometimes goes unspoken. Um, but they're really good engines for moving some of that along. Oh, and then of course, safety is always paramount. I'm passionate about this, as you can probably tell, because I get I get a little giddy. But safety is really paramount in ports again, especially for all of our operators. Um, for fuel facilities, for our cargo facilities, we need to make sure that we're storing things correctly, that things are built to resilient standards, so that we're not having disasters like they had in Beirut. We want our port facilities to be safety at the forefront and really just supporting us in terms of disasters, never contributing to them.
Yeah, I love that. I was at a event a couple weeks ago where an individual from one of the Great Lakes ports mentioned that they need to do a better job of marketing because really the ports and the port sector is so safe, and there maybe used to be a stigma where you'd send people there and you'd be worried they wouldn't come back home at night, and of course nothing could be further from the truth now. And so presenting, kind of going back to that recruiting qualified workforce issue, making sure that people are aware this is a safe, interesting, and exciting field is something I think we can all do a little bit better at. So, final question for you: how can elected officials and city leaders support the continued improvement of our ports?
Yeah. So this is a $1 billion question, I'm sure. Elected officials could do a lot for us. As elected officials, they should be the ones that are talking to the ports and understanding the impact that they have on our communities. Because maybe citizens don't understand everything that a port does to enable their life to be great. But our politicians should be doing it. We need them to be advocates for us in the government. So we want them to understand the needs and limitations of our port facilities and also what investment for ports could mean for our communities, for the American people, because ports really are a public service. And we deliver these things to the American people, even if we are not often recognized. But with the recognition and the support of elected officials, we could really take ports beyond the 21st century into our future world vision. Really, like to see what the future of American infrastructure would be. We need that political will to do it. And then there will be some logistical things that we also will want to talk with our elected officials about. Um, we want to do a lot of construction in the US, and a lot of that would come through port facilities. And we also need to improve our own port facilities and need things to do that. Some of those are available in the US and some of them are not. So we need to work with our public officials to recognize the limitations that we currently have so they could work with us to get us to the improved point where we need to be to have these really like A+ running ports.
Anna, thank you for joining me today for this enlightening discussion on progressing America's port infrastructure. For more information on ASCE's Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.